Good morning. This month's video is going to be pretty short. I had both a person at the club and a write-in question asking almost the exact same thing about rising cuts from the offside, so crossed-armed rising cuts in gloves, HEMA gauntlets. And so I thought I would make a quick little video about it. When I teach the rising cuts in the club, just in general, one of the things that we focus on is leading with the pommel. I'll actually grab somebody's blade and say, if somebody was pinching the tip of your sword and you had to get it out, you would start with this pull, so you drive with the body, and what that does is this allows the pommel to proceed just a little bit, and we get a little bit of the snap through motion, as opposed to if you keep this fairly rigid and you push the lead arm. I don't think you get quite as good a motion, and this becomes more problematic in gloves. So if I put the Spez heavy gloves on, which I think are pretty good for mobility, but they're a little bulkier, and I think that's what both people were running into. If I'm trying to throw a crossed-armed rising cut and I try to just flop it over with the wrist, or I am over here and I push with the lead hand, that's going to feel quite awkward. If instead I really focus whether I'm turning and then rising, or I mean from here, if I think about projecting the pommel under the lead forearm, so if I do this with the turn, if I'm here and I think about really projecting that pommel to lead under that lead forearm, I can get a very tight rising cut in these bulky gloves, cross-armed, no problem. But again, if I try to push it over and up with the lead hand, or even from like a tail guard, if I try to push with the lead hand, it's going to feel bulky and it's going to feel bound up, and it's not going to feel very, very good. The other thing that I talk about with rising cuts from either side is that the lead elbow in the cut really should kind of control how high your cut goes. So what I mean by that is, for example, if I'm on an onside, if my lead elbow in this cut, the lead elbow, if I'm rising and this lead elbow stops and I keep trying to do this rising cut, I'm going to end up punching with my lead hand, torquing the back wrist. It's not going to be a very good cutting motion. Or if I'm in SE heavy, it's not necessarily going to hit very hard. So what I tell people is, if they're throwing this rising cut, this lead elbow has to end up kind of above and behind my head so that I can have a nice position. If I don't do that, if this pommel hand stops as it's leading, and then the lead hand, the primary hand continues, I'm going to end up torquing my wrist and looking all funny. And it's really the same thing here. From this crossed arm side, with or without gloves, if I try to get all crunched up, it's not going to work very well. I'm going to feel bound up. But if my lead elbow ends up above and behind my head, in gloves or without, it's going to make the whole cutting process go significantly easier. I tend to prefer to spar in the sparring gloves, although those are my heavies. But really nothing changes. I think it's a little bit easier because the sparring gloves are a slightly slimmer design. But again, if I am getting this pommel under the lead forearm as I drive, it's going to be very easy to throw rising cross-arm cuts from a frontal position, or again from the tail guard, and then of course you're going to step through. So really just kind of pay attention to where your pommel is leading, and then where the kind of first elbow in your whole cutting motion is going to end up. If you're from the onside, left elbow is not ending up above and behind your head, or from the crossed arm side, if your right elbow isn't ending up a little bit above and behind your head, I think you're probably messing up the mechanics a little bit. And then if you are kind of punching across with the lead hand in gloves, it's going to exacerbate the fact that your mechanics are a little off, and it's going to be harder to have that nice tight rising cut. So it's a short video. It's not a big thing, but since I had a couple questions very close together that were almost exactly the same, thought I'd just throw it up there for this month and see if it was helpful to anybody else. Have a good one.